of the shutdown and all of the names that are being hurled at the Democrats, cowardice, caving, ineffective, feckless, I believe that all of those are probably true. All of those have merit. But if we're going to agree that the Democrats were cowardly and ineffective, we have to also agree that the Trump administration was cruel. Let us not forget that this administration went to the courts to ask for permission on multiple occasions to allow its people to starve, that it was willing to starve its people as a means to a political end. It didn't care if there were servicemen in food lines. It didn't care if it were people in red states. It didn't care if it was farmers. It didn't care if it were rural voters. They didn't care who starved.
If you have been watching everything happening with D.L. Hughley, Jimmy Kimmel, the FCC, Donald Trump, MAGA supporters, and all the talk around free speech, then stay right here because this story is wild from start to finish, and trust me, you will want to watch all the way to the very end so you do not miss a single detail. What D.L. Hughley said shook the room, shook comedy, shook politics, and shook the entire conversation around who gets to joke, who gets punished, and who gets a pass. And when you hear how he breaks down the double standards between Jimmy Kimmel being pushed off air versus what Donald Trump and several other politicians and public figures have said and done, you will understand exactly why people are saying this is bigger than comedy. This is about government power, pressure, fear, and how far people will go to protect certain voices while silencing others. So get comfortable because this is deep and very eye-opening. The moment D.L. Hughley came on and reacted to ABC and Disney pulling Jimmy Kimmel after pressure from the government, you could feel the frustration. He did not sugarcoat anything. He said straight up that comedy has always poked fun at presidents, at leaders, at culture, at scandals, at everything. He reminded everybody how Saturday Night Live joked about Gerald Ford being clumsy, how they mocked George W. Bush for mispronouncing simple words, how they joked about Bill Clinton during his entire scandal. Comedy has always been part of politics, and politics has always been part of comedy. But what he has never seen, what most comedians have never seen, is a president using government power to punish a comedian or threaten a network. He explained it clearly. It is one thing for people to get mad on social media, to call a show and demand someone get fired, to complain in comments, to call it cancel culture. That is one thing. It may be annoying, it may be loud, but it is still the public. It is not the government. But when the most powerful man in the world uses pressure on the FCC, threatens a broadcast license, blocks mergers unless networks bow down and silence certain voices, that becomes a totally different thing. That becomes the government stepping in and trying to control what jokes can be told, who can speak, and what opinions are allowed. And D.L. Hughley made it very clear that the First Amendment protects citizens from government punishment, not from people complaining, not from people being upset, but from the government using its power to silence voices it does not like. He said that pretending these two things are the same is dishonest, and it is exactly why this moment is so dangerous. And then he got even deeper with it. He pointed out how several people connected to Donald Trump, including folks like Laura Loomer, Mike Lee, and even Donald Trump himself, have made jokes that were way more offensive, way more harmful, and targeted real victims, yet none of them lost their jobs or their platforms. He reminded viewers that Laura Loomer joked about George Floyd being sober for 5 years and nothing happened to her. Mike Lee joked about 2 congressmen being shot and nothing happened. Donald Trump joked about Nancy Pelosi's husband being attacked and nothing happened. So why is Jimmy Kimmel, a late-night host known for political humor, suddenly the one being punished? Why is the government stepping in now? Why is pressure being used only when it is jokes about Trump or people connected to him? Why does there seem to be no problem when the joke targets someone who is black, someone who is a Democrat, or someone who is not aligned with MAGA culture? And here's where D.L. Hughley hit another strong point. He said he has defended comedians on both sides, even when he did not like the jokes they told. When a comic at the RNC joked about Puerto Rico being a floating pile of garbage, he defended the comic's right to say it, because free speech is not about protecting only what you like. Free speech is about protecting speech, period. He said the FCC stepping in to punish Jimmy Kimmel is not normal, and it is not something that anyone should brush off because once the government starts telling people what they can and cannot joke about, it never stops there. That is why he said you cannot cheer on government punishment just because you currently like the leader in charge, because the same power that works for your side today might be used against your side tomorrow. Then David Letterman came in with his own reaction, and he did not hold back either. He said flat out that this is what authoritarian governments do: control media, punish comedy, silence voices. Letterman said the idea that ABC and Disney were scared to upset Trump and therefore decided to pull Jimmy Kimmel shows how dangerous this has become. He said this is not how America works. You can't fire someone because you want to keep a president happy. That is media manipulation. That is fear. That is politics controlling entertainment. And he warned that if this continues, everybody in comedy, from late-night hosts to stand-up comics to small creators, will feel it eventually. And D.L. Hughley kept going. He talked about how this is not even about liking or hating Jimmy Kimmel. It's about what message this sends to every comedian, every artist, every dissident, every person who uses comedy to speak truth, shine light, or challenge power. He explained that satire is more important now than ever because more than 60% of Americans get their news from comedians, social media personalities, or satirical platforms. Comedy has become a major source of information for younger audiences, and that is exactly why governments want to control it. If they can silence the comedians, they can control what messages reach the people. He also reminded everyone that Obama and Trump are cultural icons, not just presidents. They influence fashion, music, social media, and entire movements. So when comedy targets them, it's not just political commentary, it's cultural commentary. But if one is allowed to be joked about and the other is not, then we no longer have equal freedom, we have selective freedom. And selective freedom is not freedom at all. Then he hit the younger demographic angle. He said one of the biggest reasons so many young people supported Trump earlier on was because they hated what they called cancel culture. They felt like they couldn't say anything without someone getting offended. They felt like jokes were being policed. They felt like everything was too sensitive. But now those same people are quiet while the government, not the public, but the government, steps into silent speech. DL said that proves something. Cancel culture was terrible to them when it came from the people, but it's somehow fine when it comes from the government. And he said that is the most backward stance anyone can take, because if you believe in free speech, you believe in free speech for everybody. And he also pointed out how this moment sets a dangerous standard for the future. People forget that whoever holds power today will not be in power forever. Eventually, the same rule being used to punish Jimmy Kimmel could be used to punish a conservative host or a right-leaning comedian or anyone who cracks a joke that the next president does not like. He said Americans should be very careful cheering for government censorship because no one escapes it once it becomes normal. And then he talked about how comedy itself has changed. He said every joke has a victim now. Every joke upsets somebody. Every joke triggers someone. But comedians are supposed to push boundaries, point out truth, challenge hypocrisy, and make people think. Comedy has never existed to keep everybody comfortable. And with Obama and Trump being the two most popular presidents in modern culture, the jokes about them are bigger, louder, and more influential. That is exactly why the government wants to control them. So what happens next? According to DL and Letterman, this is only the beginning. More comedians are going to speak out. More networks are going to field pressure. More voices are going to be tested. And the question becomes, do we want a country where comedians are scared to joke? Do we want a country where politicians decide which punchline is allowed? Or do we want a country where people get to hear everything and decide for themselves what they agree with? And before we go deeper, make sure you stay with me till the very end because there is something DL said about history, power, and what Americans forget, and it ties everything together in a way that will blow your mind. He said one of the biggest reasons people keep repeating the same mistakes is because they don't learn from the past. Every time free speech gets weakened, it never ends well. Every time governments begin controlling art, it ends with less creativity, less honesty, and less truth. He said Americans have forgotten that the same tools being used right now could easily be used against them in the future. He said this is why he has always defended free speech even when he hated the joke, because if you take it away from one person, you take it away from everyone, and once you lose it, you never get it back easily.
And finally, he talked about how the power of the audience matters. He said Americans have two knobs, one to turn off the TV and one to change the channel. If you don't like a comedian, turn it off. Don't watch it, but don't demand that nobody else gets to watch it. Don't demand government punishment. Don't demand censorship, because that's not how freedom works. He reminded the audience that this is not about protecting one comedian. This is about protecting the idea that people can speak, joke, challenge, question, and create without fear that the government will knock on their door or threaten their livelihood. He said this moment is a test, and the way Americans respond will shape comedy, politics, and speech for years to come.
And as we move deeper into this situation, you start to realize that this is not just about Jimmy Kimmel or D.L. Hughley speaking on a news show. This is a turning point in entertainment and politics. And it exposes just how thin the line has become between comedy and power. That is why you should stay with me until the end, because the more you hear, the more you are going to understand how much is at stake when a comedian gets suspended because the government did not like a joke. And what D.L. Hughley said later in the conversation explains why this moment could have long-term consequences for comedians, for the media, and for the entire way America talks about politics. D.L. pointed out how Trump and his allies have protected every joke they made, no matter how harmful or insensitive, but suddenly felt attacked when the joke went in the opposite direction. And when the FCC stepped in, it showed that this was not a fair battle. He said comedy is supposed to be the one place where both sides get roasted, because humor is part of how Americans understand power. But now, a joke about Trump has turned into a federal issue, and that alone should make every citizen stop and think. He said it is scary to watch a government try to control what comedians can say, and even scarier when networks go along with it out of fear. That fear is exactly what allows authoritarian behavior to grow. Because when one powerful person learns that they can silence a voice just by threatening money or licensing, they will keep doing it until no one dares to joke about them at all. He reminded people that this is how you lose creative freedom. This is how societies start normalizing censorship. And the problem is that it never looks dangerous at the start. It always begins with one person getting punished for one joke and people saying, well, maybe that joke crossed the line. But then the next person gets punished, and the next, and eventually the rules become so strict that nobody jokes at all. Comedy becomes flat, artists become scared, networks stop taking risks, and the public becomes used to one-sided messaging where only government-friendly voices get airtime. And something D.L. Hughley said hit hard. He said Americans love to argue about cancel culture, but none of that compares to what government censorship looks like. Cancel culture is the public reacting. Government censorship is the government punishing. And when the government punishes jokes, that is the beginning of something dangerous. That is why he said people cheering for Jimmy Kimmel's punishment now will regret it later, because once the government learns it can silence one voice, it will go after everyone who steps out of line. Left, right, center, does not matter. He said people forget that government officials change. Today it might be someone you support. Tomorrow it might be someone you fear. And when that day comes, you will wish that free speech had been protected for everyone. That is the part people never think about. Freedom only works when it is universal. If only one side has the right to joke, then there is no freedom at all. Then he talked about the impact on younger viewers. He said the younger demographic is the one that consumes comedy the most, and many of them get their political awareness from late-night shows, podcasts, stand-up specials, and satire. Young people grew up with people like Trevor Noah, Stephen Colbert, Jon Stewart, Dave Chappelle, and of course, D.L. Hughley himself, shaping the conversation. They are used to political jokes. They are used to comedy calling out leaders. They are used to humor exposing hypocrisy. So when they see a comedian get punished by the government, they immediately see the red flag because they know comedy is not supposed to serve power. Comedy is supposed to challenge it. And that is why this suspension hit so hard. It has made comedians worry about what they can and cannot say. It has made networks worried about what jokes they allow to air. And it has made the public wonder how far political pressure can go. Because if they can silence Jimmy Kimmel today, what is stopping them from silencing Stephen Colbert or Seth Meyers or any comic on stage in a small club? D.L. Hughley said this is why artists and performers are so important right now. They are one of the last groups willing to speak truth in ways that politicians cannot. They use humor to say the things everyone is thinking but is too scared to say. They take risks, they expose the game, and when the government tries to shut them down, that means the jokes hit too close to the truth. And he also explained how comedians have always played a major role in democracy. George Carlin, Richard Pryor, Chris Rock, Eddie Murphy. These are people who told jokes that shaped public thinking, even when they made people uncomfortable, even when the jokes were harsh. But they told the truth. Comedy has always been a mirror that reflects society. And if the government breaks that mirror, then society loses a huge part of its honesty. And this is why D.L. Hughley believes the role of the satirist is more important today than ever before. Because news has changed, media has changed. People don't trust everything they see on TV. Many young people don't even watch traditional news. They go to comedians and creators to make sense of the world. That is why political comedy has become so powerful. And when something becomes powerful, the government wants to control it. He explained how 2 of the last 3 presidents, Barack Obama and Donald Trump, were more than just leaders. They were symbols of massive cultural moments. Their presidencies shaped memes, trends, TikToks, music, movies, and entire online communities. Obama became the face of cool president culture, and Trump became the face of anti-establishment chaos culture. So when you joke about them, the jokes hit harder, cut deeper, and spread faster. That is why Trump and MAGA supporters reacted so strongly to Jimmy Kimmel's joke. It was not just a joke, it was a cultural blow. And instead of responding with humor, they responded with force. And here's the twist DL pointed out. Trump built his brand on saying whatever he wanted. He attacked people, he insulted reporters, he mocked opponents. He made jokes that crossed lines nobody had crossed before, and instead of apologizing, he doubled down. His supporters loved him for it. They said they wanted someone who was not scared to offend. They said they wanted someone who fought cancel culture. But now, the same people who cheered Trump's no-filter jokes are cheering the government for punishing Jimmy Kimmel's jokes. That's the double standard DL called out. That is why he said you cannot pretend this is about standards. This is about control. He said Trump supporters loved free speech when they were the ones doing the talking. But when that same energy came back at them from comedians, suddenly they wanted censorship. That is the hypocrisy DL exposed, and he said this moment is proving once again that some people only support free speech when it benefits their side. And that is not how the First Amendment works. Then he went even deeper by pointing out how big companies react to political pressure. He said corporations like ABC and Disney don't want trouble. They want to protect their money. They want their mergers approved. They want their broadcast licenses safe. So when a president threatens to block renewals or interfere with business deals, companies panic. They fold. They silence whoever they need to silence so they don't lose billions. And that silence becomes a chain reaction. If one network gives in, the others will eventually too. And then comedy becomes controlled, not by creators, but by fear of punishment. And that is why D.L. Hughley said Americans should be very worried about what happens next. Because once companies give in to pressure from the government, they rarely go back to standing firm. They stay scared. They stay cautious. And when media becomes cautious, humor dies. Jokes get watered down. Late night becomes safe. Comedy gets cleaned up to the point where it's just noise. And that means the public loses another tool to challenge power. And what D.L. Hughley said toward the end might be the most important part of all. He said at the end of the day, free speech only works when everybody has the right to hear everything. He said if you don't like what Jimmy Kimmel says, change the channel. If you don't like what a comic says, skip the clip. If you don't like what a satirist says, ignore them. But nobody should push the government to silence them. Because once the government can silence a joke, the next step is silencing criticism, and the next step after that is silencing protest. And when protest gets silenced, freedom dies. He said history shows that every time a government begins controlling what people can say, it always ends with more restrictions, more punishment, and less democracy. And that is why this moment matters so much. So don't go anywhere, because there is still more to uncover. There is more to say about how this affects not just comedians, but also musicians, actors, influencers, and even regular people who speak their mind online.
There is more to talk about when it comes to the emotional impact this has on artists who now feel like they have to censor themselves. And there is more to reveal about the bigger picture that D.L. Hughley wants people to understand.